Her body trembled with rage as the "for sale" sign mocked her very existence, until the stranger with storm-grey eyes stepped forward and offered his entire ranch, his life's work, to save a woman he'd never met. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The town of Redemption Creek stirred with unusual excitement that morning. Word had spread faster than wildfire across the dusty streets and weathered storefronts that something extraordinary would happen at noon. Sheriff Bo Tanner had posted notices on every door from the saloon to the general store. Public auction, town square, midday. Isabella Reyes stood on the wooden platform, her hands bound loosely before her with rough hemp rope that bit into her wrists. Her dark hair fell in tangled waves around her face, partially hiding the bruise blooming on her cheek. The simple grey dress hung too large on her frame, borrowed from the sheriff's wife who had clucked her tongue in sympathy but offered no real help. Isabella kept her eyes fixed on the wooden planks beneath her feet, refusing to meet the curious, hungry gazes of the crowd gathering in the town square. "For sale," read the crude sign nailed to the platform beside her. No other explanation was offered. None was needed. The townsfolk of Redemption Creek understood perfectly well what it meant when a woman, especially one with skin the color of sun-baked earth and eyes as dark as midnight, stood on the auction block. 3 days earlier, she had been discovered hiding in Jeb Wilson's barn after his prize stallion went missing. The fact that she had been half-starved, her feet bleeding from walking barefoot across desert terrain for days, mattered little to the hastily assembled town council. She was Mexican, alone, and found where she shouldn't be. In their minds, the case was clear. Thief, vagrant, probably worse. "We start the bidding at $20, Sheriff Tanner called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed crowd. "This here girl was caught stealing, but she's young and strong, good for housework, cooking, whatever needs doing. $20 to pay for her crimes and the trouble she's caused." "Do I hear 20? Isabella's shoulders tensed, but she refused to tremble. They could sell her body, but she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her spirit break. Her father had been a proud man, a rancher with land of his own before the drought and the raiders came, before they hung him from his own oak tree and took everything. She was her father's daughter, even now. "25, called a voice from the crowd. Tom Webster, the blacksmith, a man known for his heavy hand with his apprentices. 30, countered another, the saloon owner, whose eyes lingered too long on the curve of Isabella's neck. The bidding continued, voices rising over one another as the price climbed. $50, 60. Each number hammered another nail into the coffin of Isabella's freedom. She had heard stories of girls sold this way, their lives worth less than a good horse. Some disappeared into remote ranches, never to be seen again. Others endured lives of servitude that differed from slavery only in name. At the edge of the crowd, almost hidden in the shadow of the general store's awning, stood Caleb Holden. He watched the proceedings with eyes the color of river stones after rain, gray and deep and unreadable. Unlike the other men who jostled for position, he made no move to approach the platform. His worn leather vest and simple cotton shirt set him apart from the Sunday finery many had donned for the occasion. A quiet man who ran a small ranch north of town, Caleb was known more for his absence than his presence in Redemption Creek. $90, called out Harlan Beck, a cattle baron whose ranch sprawled across the western valley. A cruel smile played across his lips as he tipped his hat toward Isabella. "And worth every penny, I'd wager," the crowd murmured. It was an outrageous sum for a suspected horse thief, but everyone knew Beck's interest had nothing to do with labor. His last 3 housekeepers had all left under mysterious circumstances, their eyes hollow and their tongues stilled by fear or shame, or both. "Any other offers?" Sheriff Tanner asked, already reaching for his gavel. "Going once." Isabella finally raised her eyes, scanning the crowd with a gaze that held no plea, only quiet defiance. Her life might be forfeit, but she would face whatever came next standing tall. "Everything I own." The voice cut through the square like a knife, quiet but firm. The crowd parted as Caleb Holden stepped forward, his hat in his hands. Dust clung to his boots and the hem of his jeans, as if he'd ridden hard to reach town in time. "What's that, Holden?" the sheriff asked, confusion furrowing his brow. "I said, I'll give everything I own." Caleb's voice remained steady, though his knuckles whitened around the brim of his hat. "My ranch, my livestock, my savings, all of it." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Beck's face darkened with anger. "Now see here," the sheriff began. "This isn't how—" "You said auction," Caleb interrupted, his gaze never leaving Isabella's face. Something passed between them then, a current of understanding that needed no words. "And I'm making my bid, everything I have for her freedom." "This is absurd," Beck sputtered. "You can't possibly—" "Actually," interjected Judge Wilson, who'd been watching the proceedings with growing discomfort. "Legally speaking, he can." The old judge had been silent until now, bound by the town council's decision, despite his private misgiving. "An auction is an auction, and a man can bid what he chooses." Sheriff Tanner looked from Caleb to Beck to the judge, clearly caught between the letter of the law and the power of the cattle baron. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mr. Holden, are you certain? Everything you own is quite a price for—" "I'm certain," Caleb said, finally breaking his gaze from Isabella to look directly at the sheriff. "Draw up the papers. I'll sign them now." Isabella stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. Why would this man, this stranger, sacrifice everything for her? What could he possibly want in return that would be worth such a price? As the crowd erupted in shocked conversations, Caleb approached the platform. Up close, Isabella could see the fine lines around his eyes, carved by sun and wind and something deeper, a sadness that mirrored her own. "Ma, why?" she whispered, speaking for the first time since her capture. Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the rope binding her wrists and began to untie it with careful fingers. "Because," he finally said, his voice so low only she could hear, "some things are worth everything." The sheriff approached with papers in hand, his expression caught between confusion and resignation. Beck stormed away, shoving bystanders aside in his fury, and as the rope fell away from her wrists, Isabella felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps its distant cousin. She had been sold to the highest bidder, but somehow, impossibly, it felt like the first step toward freedom. The clerk's office of Redemption Creek was a small, dusty room tucked behind the jailhouse. Afternoon light filtered through grimy windows, casting long shadows across the scarred wooden desk where Sheriff Tanner now sat, pen in hand. The air smelled of old paper and coffee gone cold in forgotten mug. "This ain't right, Holden," Tanner muttered, his weathered face creased with concern as he looked up from the deed transfer. "Giving up your whole damn life for some Mexican girl you don't even know. What in God's name are you thinking?" Caleb stood with his hat in his hands, his posture straight, despite the weight of what he was surrendering. "Just finish the paperwork, Sheriff." At his side, Isabella remained silent, her dark eyes watching every movement, every signature. She stood differently now, taller, shoulders back, no longer the cowering prisoner. The sheriff's wife had found her a shawl to wrap around her shoulders, offering some small dignity against the curious stares that followed them from the auction block to the office. "You realize what you're doing?" Judge Wilson asked, adjusting his spectacles. 300 acres, your cattle, your horses, everything your father built, all for—" He gestured vaguely toward Isabella, unable to find words that wouldn't sound cruel in their inadequacy. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing," Caleb replied, his voice quiet but firm. His weathered hands, calloused from years of ranch work, didn't tremble as he signed his name to the final paper. "And it's worth it." The sheriff shook his head, stamping the documents with more force than necessary. "Your property transfers to the town of Redemption Creek to be auctioned off to cover the debt." He slid a small pouch across the desk. "This here's all that's left, just enough for a stage ticket out of here, maybe two if you're careful." Caleb pocketed the pouch without counting its contents, and the charges against Miss Reyes dropped Judge Wilson confirmed, though his expression suggested he found the entire situation distasteful. She's free to go, though where she'll go is another matter entirely. Isabella's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her shawl. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She had gained her freedom only to find herself homeless and penniless, dependent on the mercy of a stranger who had just surrendered everything he owned. "She's coming with me," Caleb stated simply, as if discussing nothing more significant than the weather. The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. "With you? And where exactly might that be, now that you don't have a home to your name?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Caleb's face. He hadn't thought that far ahead, had only known that he couldn't stand by and watch Isabella sold like cattle to Harlan Beck. Everything that followed his impulsive bid had been reaction, not plan. Before he could answer, the door to the office swung open. A tall man in a well-tailored suit stepped inside, removing his hat to reveal silver-streaked dark hair and intelligent eyes that quickly assessed the room's occupants. "Mr. Holden," he said with a slight nod, "I believe we have some business to discuss." "Mr. Edwards," Sheriff Tanner said, surprise evident in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you in town today. Word travels fast," Edwards replied, his attention still fixed on Caleb, especially when it involves a man surrendering his entire livelihood at a public auction. James Edwards owned the largest mercantile business in the territory, with stores in 3 counties and freight contracts with the railroad. Unlike many of the territory's wealthy men, he had a reputation for fair dealing and quiet philanthropy. "Whatever business you have can wait," Judge Wilson said, gathering his papers. "We've just concluded." "Actually," Edwards interrupted smoothly, "my business concerns the very transaction you've just completed." He turned to Caleb. "I'd like to speak with you privately, Mr. Holden." "And Miss," he paused, looking at Isabella with a respectful nod. "Reyes," she supplied, her voice soft but clear. "Isabella Reyes." "Miss Reyes," Edwards completed with a smile that carried no mockery or condescension. "And perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable." 20 minutes later, they sat in Edwards' private office above his mercantile. Unlike the clerk's office, this room spoke of prosperity and taste: Persian rugs, leather-bound books, and windows clean enough to show the main street of Redemption Creek in perfect clarity. A pot of coffee steamed on a side table alongside a plate of biscuits that neither Caleb nor Isabella had touched. "I'll be direct, Mr. Holden," Edwards said, settling behind his desk. "I've been looking to expand my ranching interests for some time. Your property borders the eastern section of land I purchased last spring. I'd like to make you an offer." Caleb's expression remained carefully neutral. "The property isn't mine to sell anymore." "Not officially, no," Edwards agreed, "but the town council won't auction it for at least 30 days. Standard procedure. I'm prepared to pay considerably more than its market value, with the understanding that the town gets what you owed for Miss Reyes, freedom, and you receive the balance." Isabella watched Caleb's face, searching for some sign of his thoughts. Would he take this unexpected chance to reclaim some portion of what he'd sacrificed? And if he did, what would become of her? "Why would you do that?" Caleb asked, suspicion edging his voice. Edwards leaned back in his chair. "Partly business. Your land truly does complete a section I've been trying to consolidate. And partly because I've always believed a man willing to sacrifice everything for a principle is a man worth knowing." His gaze shifted to Isabella. "And worth helping." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then Caleb spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "If I accept this, what happens to Miss Reyes?" "That would be entirely between you and her," Edwards replied carefully. "The town's claim on her is settled. What follows is your concern, not mine." Isabella straightened in her chair. "I can speak for myself," she said, surprising both men. "I owe Mr. Holden a debt I cannot repay, but I will not be passed from one owner to another, no matter how well-intentioned." Edwards nodded slowly. "Of course, Miss Reyes, I meant no disrespect." "None taken," she replied. But I need to understand what this arrangement means for my future." Caleb turned to her, really looking at her perhaps for the first time since the auction. The afternoon light caught the determination in her eyes, the proud set of her jaw. This was no broken victim, but a woman of remarkable strength. "You owe me nothing," he said quietly. "If Mr. Edwards' offer is genuine, I'll have enough to start over somewhere. You'd be free to do the same, wherever you choose." "And if I choose to repay my debt?" Isabella asked. A faint smile touched Caleb's lips. "Then we'll figure that out together." Edwards cleared his throat. "There's one more thing," he said, reaching into his desk drawer. "This came for you last week, Mr. Holden. It was delivered to my store, since it came with the supply wagon from Santa Fe." He handed Caleb a slightly crumpled envelope bearing a Denver postmark. Caleb stared at it for a long moment before opening it with careful fingers. As he read the single page inside, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "What is it?" Isabella asked, unable to contain her curiosity. "It's from my cousin in Denver," Caleb said, his voice strangely distant. "My uncle died 3 months ago. Apparently, he left me his freight business." He looked up, still processing the news. "A small operation but established, with buildings, wagons, contracts." "In Denver?" Edwards asked, leaning forward with renewed interest. Caleb nodded slowly. "In Denver?" Isabella's fingers twisted in her lap, her mind racing. Denver was far away. A real city, not a dusty frontier town where a Mexican woman would always be viewed with suspicion, a place where perhaps she could disappear, reinvent herself, find work that didn't involve being owned. "Well," Edward said, breaking the thoughtful silence, "it seems fate has offered you both a new beginning. The question is, will you take it?" Outside the window, the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills, painting Redemption Creek in gold and amber. Inside, 3 people contemplated new possibilities that had not existed just hours before. "I'll take your offer, Mr. Edwards," Caleb finally said, folding the letter and tucking it inside his vest. "And then I'll be heading to Denver." He glanced at Isabella, a question in his eyes. She met his gaze steadily, her decision already made. Whatever awaited her in Denver, whatever awaited them, it had to be better than what she was leaving behind. The stagecoach rattled over the rough trail that stretched between Redemption Creek and the nearest railroad junction at Fort Collins. Inside, Isabella pressed her forehead against the window glass, watching the landscape change from desert scrub to rolling foothills dotted with pine and aspen. Her few possessions, a small bundle of clothes donated by the mercantile owner's wife and a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, sat on her lap. Across from her, Caleb Holden dozed lightly, his hat pulled low over his eyes, his body swaying with the rhythm of the coach. 3 days had passed since the auction, 3 days of whispers and sidelong glances as they prepared to leave town. 3 days of Isabella wondering if she had made the right choice in accepting Caleb's invitation to accompany him to Denver. She knew nothing about this quiet man, except that he had sacrificed everything to save her from Harlan Beck's clutches. Such sacrifice demanded either madness or nobility, and she wasn't yet certain which drove him. The coach hit a particularly deep rut, jolting Caleb awake. He straightened, adjusting his hat and glancing out the window to get his bearings. "Should reach Fort Collins by nightfall," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "We can catch the morning train to Denver." Isabella nodded, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the rough fabric of her borrowed dress. "What will happen when we arrive?" she asked, the question that had been circling her mind for days, finally finding voice. Caleb studied her for a moment before answering. "My uncle's business is called Holden Freight and Supply. According to his lawyer's letter, it's a small operation, 4 wagons, a warehouse, and contracts with several businesses in the mining towns west of Denver." He paused. "Beyond that, I don't rightly know." "And what about me?" Isabella pressed. "What will be my place in this new life of yours?" The directness of her question seemed to catch Caleb off guard. He removed his hat, running a hand through his sand-colored hair as he considered his response. "That depends on what you want," he finally said. "I made you a promise of freedom, not servitude. In Denver, you could find work as a seamstress, perhaps, or in one of the hotels. You speak good English, you're educated, you'd have choices." "Choices," Isabella repeated softly, testing the word. "I haven't had those in a long time." The stagecoach rounded a bend, revealing a sweeping vista of mountains in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. Isabella caught her breath at the sight. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "Yes," Caleb agreed. though his eyes weren't on the mountains. In Denver, people mind their business more than in small towns. It's growing fast, all kinds of folks making new starts. No one would need to know where you came from or what happened at that auction block, Isabella added, her voice hardening slightly at the memory. Caleb nodded. That's right. Silence fell between them again, more comfortable than before. Outside, the landscape continued to transform, each mile putting more distance between them and Redemption Creek. Between Isabella and a past she was determined to leave behind. My father owned a ranch, she said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. South of Santa Fe, we had good land, cattle, horses. He taught me to manage the accounts, to negotiate with the buyers who came for our stock. Her hands tightened around her bundle. After the raiders came, after they killed him, I tried to keep it going. But a woman alone, she shook her head. The bank took everything. Caleb listened without interrupting, his gray eyes steady on her face. I walked north, she continued, looking for work, for a new beginning. Some towns wouldn't have me at all. Others offered only, she trailed off, unwilling to name the degradation suggested to her. And when my shoes fell apart, I took a pair from a farmhouse porch. When I was starving, I stole eggs from hen houses. I never took that stallion, though. I was just sleeping in the barn when they found me. I believe you, Caleb said simply. Isabella looked up, searching his face for any sign of judgment or pity. She found neither. Why did you do it? She asked, the question that had haunted her since the moment he had stepped forward at the auction. Why give up everything for a stranger? For a long moment, Caleb was silent, his gaze drifting to the passing landscape. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. My mother was Cheyenne, he said. My father was a trapper who settled down to ranch. They were happy for a time. Then came a hard winter and sickness, and my mother died. His jaw tightened. After that, things changed. The town that had tolerated her didn't extend the same courtesy to her half-breed son. Isabella listened, understanding dawning in her eyes. When I was 16, Caleb continued, a rancher accused me of stealing his horses, had about as much proof as they had against you, which is to say, none at all. But a judge was ready to hang me anyway. He met her gaze. My father sold everything he had to buy my freedom and a chance to start over somewhere else. We built the ranch you saw me sign away. He died believing we'd finally found a place where the past couldn't touch us. And now you've given it up, Isabella said softly. Some debts can't be repaid, Caleb replied. It only passed forward. The stagecoach began to slow as they approached a way station, a cluster of rough wooden buildings where they would change horses and take a brief rest. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. We're not so different, you and I, Isabella said, as the coach rolled to a stop. Both of us running from a past we didn't choose. Caleb offered a small smile, the first she had seen from him. Maybe in Denver, we can both stop running. The way station provided a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Isabella and Caleb ate at a rough wooden table, sharing the space with two traveling salesmen and an elderly couple heading east to visit grandchildren. If anyone thought it strange to see a Mexican woman traveling with a white man, they kept their opinions to themselves. As they prepared to board the coach again, Isabella noticed a wanted poster tacked to the station wall. Her heart froze when she saw a crude sketch that could have been her face staring back from the yellowed paper. The words beneath proclaimed, Isabella Reyes, horse thief and fugitive from justice. Caleb saw it too. Without a word, he moved to stand between her and the poster, blocking it from view of the other travelers. When no one was looking, he casually tore it down and slipped it into his pocket. Harlan Beck's work, he murmured as they climbed back into the coach. He doesn't like losing. Isabella's hands trembled slightly as she arranged her skirts. If there are posters here, there will be more in Fort Collins. In Denver. They'll be looking for a lone Mexican woman, Caleb said thoughtfully. But not a married couple. Isabella's head snapped up, her dark eyes wide with surprise. I'm not suggesting, Caleb began, then stopped, collecting his thoughts. It would be for appearance only, a way to travel safely, to give you protection of a name that isn't being hunted. Once we reach Denver, once you're settled, You could go your own way. As your wife, Isabella said slowly, testing the idea. As my widow, Caleb corrected. Caleb Holden died in Redemption Creek, in Denver. I'll use my mother's name, James Blackwood. You would be Mrs. Blackwood, a recent widow traveling to join family. It would explain your mourning clothes, your lack of possessions. Isabella considered the plan, turning it over in her mind. It was a practical solution, offering her protection not just from the law, but from the attention and advances of men who might see a lone woman as easy prey. You would do this? Another sacrifice? Caleb shook his head. Not a sacrifice, a fresh start for us both. As the stagecoach rumbled back onto the trail, Isabella found herself studying the profile of this strange, quiet man who continued to surprise her. His jaw was set in that determined way she was coming to recognize. His eyes focused on the horizon ahead. There was a steadiness to him that she had not encountered in any man since her father. Very well, Mr. Blackwood," she said finally. "It seems I have been recently widowed." A ghost of a smile touched Caleb's lip. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Blackwood." For the first time since her father's death, Isabella felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Not quite hope, not yet trust, but perhaps the seeds of both. As the coach carried them toward Fort Collins and the train that would take them to Denver, she allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, that this desperate plan might actually work, that they might actually find a way to outrun their pasts. Fort Collins greeted them with the bustle and noise of a growing frontier town. The railroad had transformed what had once been a small military outpost into a vital link between Denver and the territories to the north. Streets that had been quiet a decade earlier now teemed with freight wagons, shoppers, and travelers from all directions. As their stagecoach rolled to a stop before the Collins House Hotel, Isabella pulled her borrowed shawl closer around her shoulders, suddenly aware of how dusty and travel-worn she must appear. Beside her, Caleb, now James Blackwood, gathered their meager belongings. "We'll stay here tonight," he said quietly. "Train leaves for Denver at 9 tomorrow. I'll see about getting you some proper clothes first thing." Isabella nodded, her eyes already scanning the busy street, noting every glance in their direction, every potential threat. The weight of the wanted poster in Caleb's pocket seemed to press upon her even though it was no longer visible. A hotel porter approached to assist them, but Caleb waved him off, shouldering their small bundle himself. "My wife is tired from our journey," he explained, the lie falling easily from his lips. "A quiet room, if you have one." The hotel clerk barely glanced up as they entered the modest lobby. "Name?" he asked, pushing the register toward them. "James and Isabella Blackwood," Caleb replied, signing the false name with a steady hand. The clerk squinted at the signature, then at them. His gaze lingered a moment too long on Isabella's face, on her dark complexion that marked her as different. "Traveling far?" "Denver," Caleb answered, his tone discouraging further questions. "My wife's family is there." The clerk nodded, seeming to lose interest. "Room 12, top of the stairs. $50 for the night, includes breakfast." As they climbed the narrow staircase, Isabella felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. The first hurdle cleared. No recognition, no questions they couldn't answer. In the confines of the small, clean room with its single bed and washstand, she finally allowed herself to exhale. "I'll find somewhere else to sleep," Caleb said immediately, setting their bundle on a chair. "Maybe see if they've got another room." "No," Isabella replied more sharply than she'd intended. "A husband and wife would share a room. We can't afford to draw attention." Caleb nodded, though discomfort showed plainly on his face. "I'll sleep on the floor then." "Thank you," she said, softer now. For all of this, he acknowledged her gratitude with a slight incline of his head. "I need to send a telegram to my uncle's lawyer in Denver. Let him know we're arriving tomorrow, and we should get you some things. A dress at least, maybe a hat. We have little money," Isabella reminded him. "What Mr. Edwards paid won't last long if we're careless." "We have enough," Caleb assured her, "and once we reach Denver, once I see what my uncle left." He trailed off, unwilling to make promises he might not be able to keep. Isabella crossed to the window, peering through the lace curtains at the busy street below. "I could work, you know. I'm not afraid of it." "I know," Caleb said, and she could hear the respect in his voice. But for now, let's focus on getting to Denver safely. Everything else comes after. They ventured out together an hour later, after Isabella had washed the worst of the travel dust from her face and hands. Caleb kept close to her side as they navigated the crowded streets, his hand occasionally resting lightly at the small of her back to guide her through particularly busy intersections. To anyone watching, they would appear as any married couple, perhaps not wealthy but respectable enough. The mercantile offered a modest selection of ready-made dresses. Isabella chose the plainest one, a dark blue cotton with a high collar and long sleeves that would serve for multiple occasions. She added a simple bonnet that would help shield her face from curious eyes, and a pair of sturdy boots to replace the ill-fitting shoes she'd been given in Redemption Creek. As the shopkeeper wrapped their purchases, Isabella noticed a bulletin board near the front of the store with various notices and advertisements pinned to it. Her heart stuttered when she spotted another wanted poster, her own face staring back at her. Caleb saw it too. Without drawing attention, he moved to stand before it, blocking it from general view, while Isabella completed her transaction. When the shopkeeper turned to help another customer, Caleb casually tore the poster down and tucked it inside his vest. "They're increasing the reward," he murmured as they stepped back onto the street. "At $100 now." Isabella's mouth went dry. "Beck must be very determined, or very angry," Caleb replied grimly. "Either way, we need to be careful. Change your appearance as soon as we get back to the hotel." In the privacy of their room, Isabella transformed herself. The new dress fit well enough, and with her hair pinned severely back and the bonnet framing her face, she looked decidedly different from the wild-haired, desperate woman depicted on the posters. When she had finished, she turned to Caleb for his assessment. "Well," she asked, smoothing the fabric of her skirt with nervous hands. He studied her for a long moment. "You look like a respectable widow," he finally said. "No one would connect you to those posters now." Relief washed through her. "Good. There's something else we should discuss," Caleb said, settling into the room's single chair. "If we're to maintain this story, we need to know more about each other. A husband and wife would know things, histories, habits, preferences." Isabella sat on the edge of the bed, understanding the wisdom in his words. "What do you want to know?" "Everything you're willing to tell," he answered simply. "And I'll do the same." And so, as evening settled over Fort Collins, they shared their stories. Isabella spoke of her childhood on her father's ranch, of her mother who had died when she was 12, of her dreams of someday having land of her own again. Caleb told her of his mixed heritage, of the prejudice he had faced, of the quiet determination that had driven him to build something from nothing after his father's death. They spoke of small things too, favorite foods, books they had read, places they had seen. With each revelation, the fiction they were creating gained substance, became more convincing, more real. "We met in Santa Fe," Caleb suggested, crafting their shared history. "And I was there buying horses. You were helping your father with his business." Isabella nodded, adding her own details. "We married quickly, within a month. My father had just died, and I had no other family. We lived on my ranch for 3 years. Caleb continued, "until I fell ill last winter. Pneumonia," Isabella supplied. "You never fully recovered. When your uncle's letter came about the business in Denver, we decided to make a fresh start. But I weakened on the journey," Caleb finished. "Died in a small town called Redemption Creek. The local doctor said my heart simply gave out." Isabella's eyes met his across the room. "The good people there helped the grieving widow continue her journey to Denver, to the family waiting for her there." For a moment, neither spoke. The fabricated history hung between them, a shared secret, a mutual protection. "Do you think anyone will believe it?" Isabella finally asked. "People believe what makes sense to them," Caleb replied. "A widow traveling to join family is a common enough story. No one looks too closely at common stories." As night descended fully, they prepared for sleep. Caleb made a pallet on the floor with spare blankets, while Isabella took the bed. Though they had spent the previous nights in the same stagecoach, this felt different somehow, more intimate, despite the careful distance they maintained. "Caleb," Isabella said softly into the darkness, "what happens if they catch me?" The question had haunted her since they left Redemption Creek, but only now did she find the courage to voice it. Caleb was silent for so long that she thought he might have fallen asleep. When he finally answered, his voice was low but firm. "They won't," he said. "I won't let that happen." "You can't promise that," she whispered. "No," he agreed, "but I can promise I won't abandon you. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." It was a simple pledge, made in the darkness of a rented room by a man she barely knew, yet somehow it carried more weight than all the elaborate vows exchanged in churches and courthouses. Because Caleb Holden, now James Blackwood, had already proven the worth of his word in the most dramatic way possible. As Isabella drifted towards sleep, she realized that for the first time since her father's death, she was not entirely alone. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because the burden she carried seemed lighter when shared. Terrifying because she had learned the hard way that connection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability too often led to loss. Yet as sleep finally claimed her, one certainty remained. Tomorrow, they would board a train to Denver, and whatever awaited them, they would be faced together. The train to Denver rattled along the tracks, its rhythmic clacking a counterpoint to the steady beat of Isabella's heart. She sat beside the window, watching the landscape transform from the foothills around Fort Collins to the open plains that stretched toward the distant silhouette of Denver. Beside her, Caleb James, she reminded herself, read a newspaper he'd purchased at the station, though she noticed his gaze lifting frequently to scan their fellow passengers. They had boarded early, securing seats at the rear of the car where they could observe everyone who entered. The train wasn't crowded. A few businessmen in suits with leather portfolios, a young mother with 2 sleeping children, an elderly couple returning from visiting family in Cheyenne. No one who looked like a lawman, no one who paid them any particular attention. Still, Isabella couldn't shake the tension that had settled between her shoulder blades. Every time the train slowed at a small station, every time new passengers boarded, she found herself holding her breath until they had passed by without a second glance. "You look like you're expecting ghosts," Caleb murmured, folding his newspaper. "Aren't I?" she replied softly. "Ghosts of what might have been if you hadn't stepped forward that day." His expression softened. "Try to rest. We've still got an hour before we reach Denver." Isabella nodded, allowing her eyes to close, though sleep remained elusive. Instead, her mind filled with images of what awaited them. A city she had never seen, people she had never met, a business she knew nothing about, and beneath it all, the constant fear of discovery. The lawyer's office was located on Larimer Street, in the heart of Denver's business district. After securing rooms at a modest boarding house run by a widow who asked few questions, they made their way through streets crowded with wagons, carriages, and pedestrians, hurrying in all directions. Isabella had never seen so many people in one place, nor buildings that rose 3 and 4 stories high, their facades gleaming with glass windows and polished brass fixtures. "It's overwhelming," she admitted, staying close to Caleb's side. "We'll adjust," he assured her, though she detected a hint of uncertainty in his voice as well. The ranch had been isolated, quiet, a sharp contrast to the bustling energy of Denver. The lawyer, Henry Peterson, was a thin man with spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose and ink stains on his fingertips. He greeted them with professional courtesy, showing no surprise at Isabella's presence or her status as the supposed widow of Caleb's fictional brother. "I was beginning to wonder if you would come at all, Mr. Blackwood," Peterson said, gesturing for them to take seats across from his cluttered desk. "It's been nearly 4 months since your uncle's passing. The letter took some time to reach me," Caleb explained. "And the journey from New Mexico was complicated." Peterson nodded, requiring no further explanation. "Well, I'm glad you're here now. Your uncle's business has been in a state of limbo since his death. The warehouse manager, Mr. Donovan, has kept things running, but decisions need to be made, contracts renewed or terminated. I'd like to see the operation before making any decisions," Caleb said. "Of course." Peterson shuffled through papers on his desk, eventually extracting a thick folder. "These are the essential documents: the deed to the warehouse, inventory lists, current contracts, banking information. Your uncle was meticulous in his record-keeping. Thankfully, as Caleb accepted the folder, Peterson's gaze shifted to Isabella. Mrs. Blackwood, my condolences on your loss. I understand this must be a difficult time for you. Isabella lowered her eyes appropriately. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. It's been challenging. I can imagine, the lawyer replied, his expression sympathetic. Losing one's husband and then facing such a significant change of circumstances. Do you have family in Denver? Distant cousins, she answered, following the story they had crafted. I haven't had a chance to contact them yet. Peterson nodded. Well, should you need any assistance settling in, my wife would be happy to introduce you to some of the ladies' charitable societies. They can be quite helpful to newcomers. That's very kind, Isabella murmured, though the thought of socializing with Denver's society women filled her with dread. How long could she maintain their fiction under such scrutiny? Now, regarding the business, Peterson continued, turning back to Caleb, your uncle left specific instructions that it was to pass to you in its entirety. There are no other claimants or partners to consider. However, there are some outstanding debts that will need attention. Caleb's expression remained neutral, though Isabella noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. How significant are these debts? Not ruinous, Peterson assured him. Mostly supply costs and delayed payments from clients. The business itself is sound, with regular contracts that should provide steady income if managed properly. And the employees? Just 4 regular men. Mr. Donovan, who manages the warehouse and the books, 2 drivers, Stevens and McCoy, and a general worker named Tate, who handles loading, repairs, and odd jobs. Peterson adjusted his spectacles. But they're all experienced, reliable men who served your uncle well. I would advise keeping them on. At least initially. Caleb nodded, processing the information. I'd like to meet them today, if possible. Of course, the warehouse is just 3 blocks from here, near the rail yard. I can take you there now if you wish. Isabella touched Caleb's arm lightly. Perhaps I should return to the boarding house. This is business, after all. Peterson raised an eyebrow. Actually, Mrs. Blackwood, your presence might be beneficial. The men knew your brother-in-law was unmarried. Seeing you both together will help establish Mr. Blackwood's identity and connection to his uncle. Isabella hesitated, caught between the logic of Peterson's suggestion and her fear of deeper entanglement in their deception. He's right, Caleb said quietly. Better to face questions now, together, than leave room for doubt later. And so they walked to the warehouse, Peterson leading the way through streets increasingly industrial in character. The building itself was unremarkable, a large 2-story structure of red brick with the words Holden Freight and Supply painted in fading letters across the front. Loading docks lined one side, where wagons could back up for easier transfer of goods. A small office jutted from the front, its windows overlooking the street. As they approached, a man emerged from the office, tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a thick mustache. He squinted at them, clearly trying to place the strangers accompanying Peterson. Mr. Donovan, the lawyer called. It'd allow me to introduce James Blackwood, Colin Holden's nephew and heir, and his wife, Isabella. Donovan's eyes widened slightly as he looked Caleb up and down. Didn't know the old man had any family, he said bluntly. My uncle and I weren't close, Caleb replied, extending his hand. But I'm here now and interested in learning about the business he built. Donovan hesitated only briefly before accepting the handshake. Sorry for your loss, Mr. Blackwood. Your uncle was a good man to work for. Fair, honest, didn't tolerate nonsense. High praise, Caleb said. I hope you'll be willing to help me understand how things operate here. I'm new to the freight business. Some of the wariness left Donovan's expression. What's your background? If you don't mind my asking. Ranching, Caleb answered truthfully, in New Mexico. But circumstances changed. He glanced at Isabella, the implication clear. Donovan's gaze shifted to her, a flicker of sympathy crossing his weathered face. My condolences, Mom. Losing family is never easy. Thank you, Isabella replied softly. Perhaps we could see inside, Peterson suggested, clearly eager to move the conversation forward. The interior of the warehouse was cavernous, with goods stacked in neat rows, barrels of flour and sugar, crates of canned goods, bolts of fabric, mining equipment, and countless other supplies waiting for transport to smaller towns and mining camps in the mountains west of Denver. 2 wagons sat in various states of repair near the back wall, while a third, fully loaded and covered with oiled canvas, stood ready near the loading dock. "We run 3 main routes," Donovan explained as he led them through the warehouse. "Central City gets a delivery twice weekly, mostly mining supplies and food staples. Idaho Springs and Georgetown once a week each. Smaller settlements get monthly deliveries, weather permitting." "And it's profitable?" Caleb asked. Donovan nodded. "Has been for 8 years now. Your uncle built relationships with suppliers here in Denver and with merchants in the mining towns. They trust us to deliver on schedule, regardless of conditions." As they toured the facility, Isabella observed the operation with growing interest. This was a real business, well established and apparently respected. If Caleb could maintain it, perhaps they truly could build a life here, a legitimate life, far removed from auction blocks and wanted posters. They met the other employees. Stevens, a laconic man with a pronounced limp, who nonetheless handled the wagon teams with impressive skill. McCoy, younger and more talkative, eager to share stories of difficult mountain deliveries. And Tate, barely more than a boy, who watched them with undisguised curiosity. "Will you be selling, Mr. Blackwood?" Tate finally blurted out, earning a sharp look from Donovan. "I haven't decided yet," Caleb answered honestly. "I need to understand the business better before making any decisions." "We could show you the routes," McCoy offered. "I'm heading to Central City tomorrow. You could ride along, see how it all works." Isabella felt a flutter of alarm at the thought of Caleb leaving, even for a few days. As if sensing her discomfort, he placed a hand lightly at the small of her back. "That might be arranged," he said, "but first, I need to get my wife settled. We've had a long journey." As they prepared to leave, Donovan pulled Caleb aside. "Your uncle kept an apartment above the office," he said, gesturing to a narrow staircase. "Nothing fancy, but it's clean and furnished. Might suit you and your wife better than whatever temporary lodgings you've found." Isabella overheard the offer, and something inside her leapt at the possibility. An apartment of their own, even a modest one, would offer privacy and security that a boarding house could not. "We'd like to see it," she said before Caleb could respond. The apartment was indeed small, just 2 rooms and a tiny kitchen area. But it was clean and private, with a separate entrance from the outside staircase. A bed, a table with chairs, a small sofa, and a bookshelf stocked with volumes on business and regional history comprised the furnishings. "It's perfect," Isabella said quietly to Caleb, as Donovan showed them the kitchen facilities. He studied her face, perhaps surprised by her enthusiasm for such modest quarters. "Are you certain? We could find something larger, more comfortable." "This is safe," she replied, her voice too low for the others to hear. "And it's a new beginning. That's all I want." Later, as they walked back to the boarding house to collect their few belongings, Isabella felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, a cautious optimism she had not allowed herself to feel in far too long. "Do you think it can work?" she asked Caleb as they navigated the busy streets. "This business, this life we're creating." He considered her question carefully before answering. "I think it has a chance, more than we had 2 days ago." Isabella nodded, understanding the measured hope in his response. It was enough for now. A chance was all they needed. Days stretched into weeks as Isabella and Caleb settled into a routine at Holden Freight and Supply. The small apartment above the warehouse office became home, gradually accumulating the small touches that transformed borrowed space into something personal. A colorful blanket Isabella found at a market stall, dried wildflowers arranged in a pottery vase, curtains she sewed herself from fabric remnants. Each morning, Caleb would descend to the warehouse floor, working alongside the men to learn every aspect of the freight business. Isabella initially kept to the apartment, wary of drawing attention to herself. But as days passed without incident, her confidence grew. She began spending time in the office, reviewing ledgers and contracts, her experience managing her father's ranch accounts proving unexpectedly valuable. "You have a head for figures," Donovan remarked one afternoon, watching as she quickly identified a calculation error in the monthly receipts. The old man would have appreciated that. Isabella smiled, accepting the compliment with a small nod. My father believed women should understand business as well as men. Smart man, Donovan replied. Most businesses could benefit from that kind of thinking. It was a casual comment, but it planted a seed in Isabella's mind. Perhaps her role in this new life could be more than just hiding, more than playing the grieving widow. Perhaps she could genuinely contribute. That evening, she broached the subject with Caleb as they shared a simple dinner in their apartment. I want to help with the business, she said, or not just occasionally, but properly. Managing the books, handling correspondence, organizing shipments. Caleb looked up from his plate, surprise evident in his expression. You're certain it would mean being visible, interacting with suppliers, customers? I can't hide forever, Isabella replied. And I'm good with numbers, with organization. You've seen that yourself. He considered her words, his grey eyes thoughtful. Now the men respect you already, Donovan especially. They respect you too, she pointed out. You've earned that in just a few weeks. It was true. Caleb's quiet competence, his willingness to work alongside the drivers and loaders rather than simply giving orders, had quickly won the loyalty of the small staff. He had even made the journey to Central City with McCoy, learning the mountain routes and meeting the merchants who depended on their deliveries. We could present it as a practical arrangement, Isabella continued, a widow helping her brother-in-law with the family business. No one would question it. And if someone recognizes you, Caleb asked gently, the wanted posters may have reached Denver. Isabella set down her fork, meeting his gaze directly. It's been nearly a month. My hair is different. My clothes are different. I speak and carry myself differently now. She gestured to the window, to the bustling city beyond. And Denver isn't Redemption Creek. People here are focused on their own concerns, their own pursuits. They don't scrutinize every stranger passing through. Caleb was silent for a moment, weighing her arguments. Finally, he nodded. We'll try it. Start with managing the office, the books. If that goes well, we can consider expanding your role. The relief and satisfaction that flooded through Isabella surprised her with its intensity. She had not realized how deeply she craved purpose, how suffocating the confines of their small apartment had become despite its safety. Thank you, she said simply. Caleb's mouth curved in a slight smile. Don't thank me yet. Wait until you've dealt with Simmons at the hardware supply. He's determined to overcharge us for every nail and board. Isabella laughed, a sound that came more easily now than it had in months. I look forward to the challenge. The next morning, Isabella officially began working in the office. Donovan showed her their filing system, such as it was, and the ledgers where they tracked shipments, payments, and expenses. By midday, she had reorganized the chaotic desk, created a more efficient filing method, and identified 3 overdue payments from customers that had been overlooked. She's a natural, Donovan told Caleb that evening. It reminds me of your uncle, meticulous, doesn't miss a detail. Isabella overheard the comment as she closed the office for the day, and warmth spread through her chest. It felt good to be valued for her abilities, to contribute something meaningful to this precarious new life they were building. As summer turned to autumn, the business flourished under their joint management. Caleb's practical knowledge of horses, wagons, and mountain trails complemented Isabella's skill with finances and organization. They established new contracts with growing settlements, renegotiated terms with suppliers, and even purchased a 4th wagon to expand their delivery capacity. Their small staff grew to include a young woman named Sarah, who assisted Isabella with correspondence and record keeping, and 2 additional drivers to handle the expanded routes. The warehouse hummed with activity from dawn until dusk, and for the first time since arriving in Denver, Isabella began to believe that they might truly have found a place to belong. Yet beneath the surface of their growing success, the fiction that had brought them to Denver remained a constant presence. They maintained separate bedrooms in the apartment, careful to preserve the appearance of a proper familial relationship rather than the more complex reality reality of their situation. They spoke of Caleb's brother, Isabella's fictional dead husband when necessary, crafting memories and anecdotes that grew more elaborate with each telling. And always, Isabella scanned the faces of strangers, alert for any sign of recognition or suspicion. The wanted posters had indeed reached Denver. She had glimpsed one tacked to a board outside the sheriff's office, but the crude sketch bore little resemblance to the well-dressed, confident business associate of James Blackwood that she had become. One crisp October evening, as golden leaves drifted from the cottonwoods lining the streets near the warehouse, Caleb returned from a meeting with unexpected news. "The Rocky Mountain Railroad is expanding their line," he announced, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. "All the way to Leadville." Isabella looked up from the correspondence she was reviewing. "How soon?" "They're breaking ground next spring. Once it's complete, it will change everything for the mining towns." He sat at the table across from her, his expression troubled, despite what should have been promising news. "And for freight businesses," Isabella added, understanding the implications immediately. "The railroad will transport goods faster and cheaper than wagons ever could." Caleb nodded. "We need to adapt, or we'll be finished within a year of that line's completion." Isabella set aside her papers, mind already racing with possibilities. What if we don't fight the railroad, but work with it? Become a distribution partner, handling the last leg of delivery from the stations to the smaller settlements. That could work for some routes, Caleb agreed. "But we'd need to diversify too. Find other services, other goods to transport that the railroad won't handle." They talked late into the night, strategizing, planning, reimagining the business that had become the foundation of their new lives. It was during these conversations that Isabella felt closest to Caleb, their minds aligned, their purpose shared, the barriers between them temporarily dissolved by common challenge. "We should visit Leadville," she suggested as midnight approached. "See the location ourselves, meet the merchants, understand what they'll need once the railroad comes." Caleb looked at her thoughtfully. It would mean traveling together, staying in hotels, being seen as family. Isabella finished, "Which is our story already." "Yes," he agreed, though something in his tone suggested discomfort with the arrangement. Isabella studied his face in the lamplight, noting the furrow between his brows, the tension in his jaw. "Unless you'd prefer to go alone?" "No," he said quickly. "Two sets of eyes and ears would be better, and you understand the business side better than I do." The compliment warmed her, but didn't entirely erase the odd moment of tension. Over the months of their partnership, Isabella had become attuned to Caleb's moods, his expressions. There was something he wasn't saying. "What is it?" she asked directly. "Something's troubling you." Caleb hesitated, then sighed. "Peterson mentioned something today about appearances." Isabella stiffened. "What about them?" "Not about you," he clarified quickly. "About us, living here together, working so closely. He suggested that even though our story explains it, people talk." He thought. Caleb paused, clearly uncomfortable. "He thought I should consider finding a wife, said it would silence any gossip, make our situation more conventional." The suggestion hit Isabella with unexpected force. Of course, she thought, a respectable businessman should have a wife, not live indefinitely with his brother's widow. Their arrangement had always been temporary in theory, though neither had spoken of ending it. "I see," she said, striving to keep her voice neutral. "And what did you tell him?" "That my business arrangements were private," Caleb replied, "and that I had no interest in Denver's social circles or their opinions." Relief mingled with something else, something Isabella wasn't ready to examine too closely. "Good," she said simply. "But he wasn't entirely wrong," Caleb continued, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder. "Our situation is unusual. It invites questions we'd rather not answer." Isabella felt a chill settle in her chest. "Are you suggesting we should end our arrangement? That I should find other accommodation?" "No," Caleb said firmly, finally meeting her eyes. "I'm suggesting we go to Leadville as planned. We focus on the business, on securing our future. Everything else," he shook his head, "everything else can wait." The unspoken hung between them, heavy with implications neither was prepared to address. Their partnership had evolved far beyond the desperate agreement made in a hotel room in Fort Collins. They had built something together, not just a business, but a life, a fragile, complicated life based on necessary fictions, but a life nonetheless. Leadville, then, Isabella agreed. I'll make the arrangements tomorrow. As she prepared for bed that night, in the small room that had become her sanctuary, Isabella found herself lingering before the mirror. The woman who looked back at her was not the same one who had stood trembling on an auction block months earlier. This woman stood straight, her eyes clear and confident, her appearance neat and respectable. A woman who had remade herself through sheer determination. A woman who had found purpose and security against impossible odds. But a woman still living a lie. She touched the glass lightly, tracing the outline of her own reflection. How long could they continue this way? She wondered. How long before the past they had fled caught up with them, or the complexities of their present forced them to confront truths they had carefully avoided? And if that day came, what would remain of the life they had built together? Leadville sat nestled in the Colorado mountains like a defiant declaration of human perseverance, a city that had no business existing at 10,000 feet above sea level, where the air was thin and winter descended early and stayed late. Yet exist it did, growing rapidly as silver discoveries drew miners, merchants, and opportunists from across the country. The journey from Denver took 2 full days by stagecoach, the road winding through spectacular mountain passes and alongside rushing rivers, still carrying the last of summer's snowmelt. Isabella and Caleb traveled as the brother and sister-in-law they claimed to be, their conversation comfortable but carefully proper whenever other passengers were present. "Ooh, it's beautiful," Isabella murmured as they rounded a bend, revealing a panoramic vista of snow-capped peaks. "I never imagined mountains could be so massive," Caleb nodded, his own gaze appreciative of the rugged landscape, different from New Mexico, harsher, but there's something honest about. They arrived in Leadville as the first snow of the season began to fall, delicate flakes that melted upon touching the muddy streets, but clung to rooftops and the surrounding pine forest. The city itself was a study in contrast. Crude wooden structures alongside elegant brick buildings, saloons next to banks, brothels across from churches. Everything seemed temporary yet ambitious, as if the entire settlement were holding its breath, waiting to see whether it would become a true city or another abandoned mining camp. The Windsor Hotel stood at the center of town, 3 stories of relative luxury catering to wealthy investors and mining executives. Caleb had insisted on staying there despite the cost, arguing that they needed to present themselves as serious business people if they hoped to establish relationships with Leadville's merchants. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, the clerk greeted them as they approached the registration desk, misunderstanding their relationship despite the names Caleb had carefully written in the hotel register. Isabella tensed, waiting for Caleb to correct the mistake. Instead, he simply accepted the room key with a polite nod. "We have a corner suite on the 2nd floor as requested," the clerk continued. "The dining room serves breakfast from 6 until 9 and dinner from 5 until 8. Will you be staying long in Leadville?" "A few days," Caleb replied. "We're considering business opportunities with the coming railroad." The clerk's expression brightened. "Ah, investors. You'll find plenty of opportunity here, sir. Leadville is the future of Colorado. Mark my words." As they followed a bellboy up the staircase, Isabella leaned close to Caleb. "You didn't correct him," she whispered, "about us being married." "It seemed simpler," Caleb replied, his voice equally low. Less explanation required. The suite was indeed spacious, with a sitting room, a bedroom, and a small dressing area. Large windows offered views of the town and the mountains beyond, now obscured by the thickening snowfall. As soon as the bellboy departed, Isabella addressed the obvious complication. "I'll take the sofa," she said, gesturing to the reasonably comfortable-looking piece in the sitting room. Caleb shook his head. "You take the bed. I've slept in far worse places than a good sofa." Their eyes met briefly before Isabella looked away, a flush rising in her cheeks. Their living arrangement in Denver, with its separate bedrooms and clear boundaries, had allowed them to maintain a comfortable distance despite their daily proximity. This forced intimacy was different, unsettling in ways she wasn't prepared to examine. "We should rest," Caleb suggested, breaking the awkward silence. "Tomorrow will be busy if we want to meet with all the merchants on our list." The snowfall continued through the night, transforming Leadville into a winterscape of white-topped buildings and muffled sounds. By morning, several inches covered the ground, turning the usually muddy streets into pristine pathways that would soon be churned to slush by horses, wagons, and boots. Isabella rose early, dressing carefully in the blue dress she had purchased specifically for this trip, more fashionable than her usual practical attire, with a fitted bodice and subtle embroidery at the collar and cuffs. She pinned her hair in a neat arrangement that framed her face becomingly while still appearing businesslike. The woman who gazed back from the mirror looked confident, respectable, a woman who belonged in the world of commerce and negotiation. Caleb was already awake when she emerged from the bedroom, standing by the window in his shirt sleeves, watching the town come to life below. "You look very proper, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, a hint of teasing in his voice as he used the hotel clerk's mistaken address. Isabella smoothed her skirt, ignoring the warmth that spread through her at his implied compliment. "As do you, Mr. Blackwood. Shall we begin our conquest of Leadville's business community?" Their first meeting was with Harold Winters, owner of the largest general store in Leadville and a man known for his shrewd business sense. They found him in his office above the store, surrounded by invoices and catalog, his round face flushed from the heat of the pot-bellied stove in the corner. "Freight business, eh?" Winters said, after Caleb explained their purpose. "Got plenty of those already. Peterson's runs 3 wagons a week from Denver, and Mitchell's does the same. What makes Holden any different? We're not looking to compete with existing freight lines," Isabella replied. Before Caleb could speak, "We're planning for the future, specifically for when the railroad reaches Leadville." Winters' bushy eyebrows rose with interest. "Go on. The railroad will change everything," Isabella continued, warming to her subject. "Goods from Denver, from Chicago, even from New York will arrive faster and in greater quantities, but the railroad won't deliver directly to your door, Mr. Winters. That's where we come in. A distribution partner," Caleb added, "coordinating shipments from the depot to businesses throughout Leadville and to the smaller camps in the surrounding area. Regular schedules, guaranteed delivery, competitive rates." Winters leaned back in his chair, studying them with new respect. "You've given this some thought." "We have," Isabella confirmed, "and we're looking for partners who can see beyond the present to the opportunities ahead." By midday, they had secured tentative agreements from Winters and 2 other merchants to consider Holden Freight and Supply as their distribution partner when the railroad arrived. By evening, that number had grown to 6. Including the owner of a new hotel under construction and a mining supply company expanding its operations. "Not bad for our first day," Caleb remarked as they shared dinner in the hotel dining room that evening. The room was crowded with Leadville's prosperous citizens and visitors hoping to join their ranks. Conversation hummed around them, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter or the clink of fine glassware. "We need to speak with the mining companies tomorrow," Isabella said, already planning their next day's strategy. "And they'll have the largest shipments, the most consistent needs." Caleb nodded, though she noticed his attention had shifted to something beyond her shoulder. Following his gaze, Isabella saw a man entering the dining room, tall and well-dressed, with a familiar set to his shoulders that sent a chill through her despite the warmth of the room. "What is it?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden acceleration of her heart. "Nothing," Caleb replied, too quickly. "Just thought I recognized someone." Isabella resisted the urge to turn for a better look. "From Redemption Creek, possibly." "It's probably nothing," but his expression remained tense, his eyes tracking the man as he was seated at a table across the room. The rest of their meal passed in strained conversation, Caleb's attention clearly divided between their discussion and the man whose face Isabella still had not seen. When they finally rose to leave, Caleb positioned himself between Isabella and the stranger, effectively blocking her from view as they made their way to the staircase. Once inside their suite, Isabella confronted him directly. "Who was that man? And don't tell me it was nothing. I could see your concern." Caleb hesitated, then sighed. "I'm not certain, but he resembled one of Beck's ranch hands, the one who was with him at the auction." Fear, sharp and cold, shot through Isabella. "Here, in Leadville, that can't be coincidence." "It might be," Caleb argued, though he didn't sound convinced. "Beck has mining interests throughout the territory. His men travel widely." Isabella began to pace, her mind racing. "If it is Beck's man, if he recognizes me." "He won't," Caleb assured her. "You look completely different now. And even if he did think you familiar, he wouldn't expect to find you here, so far from Redemption Creek, in such changed circumstances." "We should leave," Isabella said. "First thing tomorrow." "We've accomplished what we came for." Caleb nodded, though reluctance showed in his expression. "If that's what you want." "It's not what I want," she replied, frustration edging her voice. "It's what's necessary. We can't risk everything we've built on the chance that man might not recognize me." They agreed to depart on the morning stage, cutting their planned week in Leadville down to just 2 days. As Isabella prepared for bed, she found herself trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. Fear of discovery, of being dragged back to face false charges, and anger at the continued power Beck held over her life, even from hundreds of miles away. Later, lying awake in the darkened bedroom, she heard Caleb moving quietly in the sitting room, his footsteps pacing back and forth like a sentry on guard. The knowledge that he was there, keeping watch, should have been comforting. Instead, it underscored the precariousness of their situation, the constant vigilance required to maintain their carefully constructed life. They had come to Leadville full of plans and ambition, ready to secure the future of their business. Now they would slink away like fugitives, always one step ahead of a past that refused to release its grip. As snow continued to fall outside, blanketing Leadville in deceptive serenity, Isabella made a decision. She would not live this way forever, constantly looking over her shoulder, fearing every unfamiliar face. Somehow, she would find a way to truly free herself, not just from the wanted posters and false accusations, but from the fear that had become her constant companion. And as that thought crystallized in her mind, another followed equally certain. Whatever path led to that freedom, she wanted Caleb walking it beside her, not out of obligation or protection, but because somewhere between the auction block and this snow-covered mountain town, he had become essential to her in ways that transcended their careful arrangement. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it brought a strange sense of calm, of rightness. Whatever came next, whatever challenges awaited them back in Denver or beyond, they would face it together. With that thought providing unexpected comfort, Isabella finally drifted into sleep, dreaming of mountain paths that led not away from danger, but toward something brighter, something yet unnamed but powerfully real. The return journey to Denver was marked by tense silence. Though they had managed to depart Leadville without incident, the specter of Beck's man, whether real or imagined, had shattered the fragile sense of security they had been building. Isabella spent much of the stagecoach ride watching the passing landscape through the window, while Caleb divided his attention between the other passengers and the road behind them, alert for any sign of pursuit. "We need to be prepared," he said quietly, as the coach rolled through the final mountain pass before the descent to the plains. "If Beck has somehow tracked you to Colorado, it won't take much effort to connect you to the business in Denver." Isabella nodded, her face composed despite the fear churning beneath her calm exterior. "What do you suggest? We can't simply abandon everything we've built." "No," Caleb agreed, "but we can be ready to leave if necessary. We should set aside funds, keep essential documents prepared, perhaps establish contacts in other cities where we might relocate if Denver becomes unsafe." The practicality of his planning both reassured and disturbed Isabella. He spoke not of if they might need to flee, but when, as if their current life were merely a temporary respite rather than a foundation for the future. "And the business?" she asked. The employees who depend on us." Caleb's expression softened. "We'll protect them as best we can. Perhaps speak with Peterson about contingency plans, ways to ensure the business continues even if we must leave suddenly." It was a bleak conversation, but necessary. By the time they reached Denver 2 days later, they had outlined a strategy. Money would be set aside in a separate account accessible from any bank in the territory. Important papers would be kept in a small case, ready for immediate departure, and they would research possible destinations where they might start over yet again if the need arose. The warehouse welcomed them back with comforting familiarity. The smell of leather and oil, the organized chaos of crates and barrels waiting for delivery, the sound of Donovan's booming voice directing the loading of a wagon bound for Georgetown. For a moment, Isabella allowed herself to believe that nothing had changed, that the shadow that had fallen over them in Leadville might be left behind in the mountains. That illusion lasted precisely 3 days. Isabella was alone in the office, reviewing contracts for new suppliers, when the bell above the door jangled. She looked up, her customary greeting dying on her lips as she recognized the man standing in the doorway. Not Beck's ranch hand from Leadville, but Sheriff Tanner himself, the very man who had presided over her auction in Redemption Creek. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to the space between them as recognition dawned in the sheriff's eyes. Isabella's hand froze on the ledger before her, her body suddenly unable to move, despite her mind screaming at her to run, to call for help, to do something. "Well," Tanner said, removing his hat, "this is unexpected." Isabella forced herself to breathe, to maintain the facade of normalcy despite the rapid pounding of her heart. "Sheriff Tanner," she acknowledged, her voice remarkably steady. "What brings you to Denver?" "Business," he replied, stepping further into the office and closing the door behind him. "Though I'd have said the same of you, Miss Reyes, if I hadn't seen you sold to Caleb Wyatt for the price of his ranch not 4 months ago." Isabella rose slowly from her chair, placing the desk between them. "You're mistaken," she said. "My name is Isabella Blackwood. I'm the widow of Thomas Blackwood, brother to James Blackwood, who owns this business." Tanner's mouth curved in a humorless smile. "That's a fine story. Almost believed it myself when I saw you at the hotel in Leadville, looking so proper and respectable. But then, disguises have always been part of your kind's nature, haven't they?" The casual bigotry in his tone ignited a flare of anger that momentarily overpowered Isabella's fear. "My kind," she repeated. "You mean business women or widows? Or perhaps you refer to those who refuse to be sold like cattle to men like Harlan Beck?" "Bold words for a fugitive," Tanner remarked, though something in his expression suggested surprise at her defiance. "Beck's got a $500 reward for your return now, dead or alive." $500. The sum hung in the air between them, a price that transformed a human life into a commodity. Isabella felt sick, but kept her chin high, her gaze steady. "What do you want, Sheriff?" she asked directly. "If you're here to collect that reward, you should know that I am not without protection in Denver." "I imagine not," Tanner agreed. "Wyatt always struck me as the careful type. Where is he, by the way? Still calling himself Blackwood, I presume." "My brother-in-law is meeting with suppliers," Isabella replied, desperately trying to calculate how much time might pass before Caleb returned. Too long, she feared, far too long. Tanner began to move around the office, examining the furnishings, the ledgers, the maps of delivery routes pinned to the wall. "And you've done well for yourselves," he observed. "Built quite the operation here. Be ashamed to lose it all." "What do you want?" Isabella repeated, her patience fraying under the strain of maintaining her composure. The sheriff turned to face her directly. "I want what any reasonable man wants, Miss Reyes. Compensation for my silence." The blatant extortion should have shocked her, but somehow it didn't. Men like Tanner had been taking what they wanted from those with less power for as long as Isabella could remember. "How much?" she asked, her tone flat. $1,000. Tanner said. "Cash. Consider it an investment in your continued privacy." The sum was substantial, not ruinous to the business, but significant enough to impact their operations and emergency fund. And there was no guarantee that once paid, Tanner wouldn't simply return for more. "I need time," Isabella said. "The business doesn't keep that much cash on hand." "You have until tomorrow," Tanner replied, settling his hat back on his head. "I'm staying at the Denver Palace Hotel, room 12. Bring the money there at noon, or I'll be having a very interesting conversation with the local sheriff about fugitives from New Mexico territory." After he left, Isabella remained frozen behind the desk, her mind racing through options, possibilities, escape routes. The bell jangled again minutes later, and she nearly cried out before recognizing Donovan's broad frame in the doorway. "Mrs. Blackwood?" he asked, concern evident in his weathered face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." In a sense, she had, a ghost from a past she had desperately tried to outrun. "I'm fine," she managed. "Just a difficult customer." Donovan's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't press further. "If you say so. Just wanted to let you know the Georgetown delivery is heading out. Should be back by Friday." Isabella nodded, grateful for the mundane update that anchored her back in the present reality of the business. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan." When Caleb finally returned late that afternoon, Isabella was waiting in their apartment, her composure brittle but intact. She told him everything: Tanner's appearance, his recognition, his demand for money. "We'll pay him," Caleb said immediately. "Buy time to make arrangements." "And then what?" Isabella asked. "He'll come back for more. Men like Tanner always do." Caleb's expression hardened. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens, one problem at a time." They spent the evening counting out the money, crisp bills from their business account, supplemented by Caleb's personal savings. $1,000 that would purchase a temporary reprieve, nothing more. "I should go alone tomorrow," Isabella said, as they secured the money in a leather pouch. "If it's a trap, there's no reason for both of us to be caught." "Absolutely not," Caleb replied, his tone brooking no argument. "We face this together." They barely slept that night, each lost in private worries about what the morning might bring. Isabella rose before dawn, dressing with particular care in her most respectable outfit, a dark green dress with a high collar and matching jacket, her hair arranged in a neat chignon beneath a modest hat. If this was to be her last day of freedom, she would meet it with dignity. The Denver Palace Hotel stood on a corner of Larimer Street, its elegant facade suggesting luxury and discretion. Inside, the lobby gleamed with polished wood and brass fixtures, the air scented with cigar smoke and expensive cologne. Isabella and Caleb moved through it with purposeful steps, giving no outward sign of their inner turmoil. Room 12 was located on the second floor, at the end of a carpeted hallway lined with identical doors. Caleb knocked firmly, his other hand resting near the pocket where Isabella knew he carried a small derringer, a precaution they had agreed upon despite the risks of armed confrontation. No response came from within the room. Caleb knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. They exchanged worried glances. Had Tanner already gone to the authorities? Was this entire meeting a ruse to get them away from the warehouse while an arrest was being arranged? Just as panic began to rise in Isabella's throat, a hotel maid rounded the corner, pushing a cart of linens. "Excuse me," Caleb called to her. "We're looking for the gentleman in room 12, Sheriff Tanner from New Mexico." The maid paused, her expression curious. "The gentleman in 12. He checked out early this morning, sir. Left before sunrise, according to the night clerk." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. "Checked out? Did he say where he was going?" The maid shook her head. "Not that I heard, but there was some commotion last night. Raised voices from his room. The guest in 11 complained about it." Caleb thanked the maid and guided Isabella back toward the staircase, his expression grave. "This isn't good," he murmured. "If he's not collecting the money, then he's gone to the authorities," Isabella finished, her voice barely audible. But when they reached the lobby, a different sight greeted them. Near the front desk, two men in badges were questioning the hotel clerk, who gestured repeatedly toward the staircase. One of the men held up what appeared to be a wanted poster, though from their distance, Isabella couldn't make out the face depicted. "The back exit," Caleb said softly, steering her toward a corridor leading away from the lobby. Now, they slipped out of the hotel through a service entrance, emerging into an alley that ran behind the building. Only when they had put several blocks between themselves and the Denver Palace did Caleb finally slow their pace. "Those weren't New Mexico lawmen," he said, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Those were Denver deputies." "Looking for us?" Isabella asked. still scanning the street anxiously. I don't think so. They seemed to be asking about someone staying at the hotel. Caleb's expression shifted as realization dawned. Tanner. They were looking for Tanner. But why would Denver deputies be looking for a New Mexico sheriff? Caleb shook his head. I don't know, but I think we should find out before we do anything else. They made their way to the offices of the Rocky Mountain News, where the daily edition was just being distributed. Caleb purchased a copy from a newsboy on the corner, and together they scanned the headlines for any mention of law enforcement activity. There, on the third page, they found it, former sheriff arrested for extortion, corruption. The article detailed the arrest of a Samuel Tanner, until recently the sheriff of San Miguel County in New Mexico Territory, on charges of extortion, evidence tampering, and abuse of office. According to the report, Tanner had fled New Mexico after investigations revealed he had been selling prisoners into forced labor, falsifying charges against innocent citizens, and pocketing fines meant for the county coffers. He was running, Isabella whispered, the full implications slowly sinking in. He wasn't here officially at all, and now he's in custody, Caleb added, relief evident in his voice. Unable to reveal your whereabouts without admitting his own crimes. Isabella leaned against a nearby wall, suddenly lightheaded, as the tension that had gripped her since Tanner's appearance began to dissipate. Do you think it's over? She asked. Truly over. Caleb folded the newspaper carefully, his expression thoughtful. Not entirely. Beck is still out there. But with Tanner exposed as corrupt, any charges he filed against you would be called into question. It's a start, not an ending. Not complete freedom, but perhaps the first real step toward it since that day on the auction block. Isabella looked up at the clear blue Colorado sky, drawing a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. Let's go home, she said softly. We have a business to run. Together, they walked back toward the warehouse, the leather pouch of money still secure in Caleb's coat pocket, no longer a bribe, but perhaps the beginning of a new future neither had dared to imagine until now. Winter descended upon Denver with a fierce determination, blanketing the city in snow and sending temperatures plummeting. The mountains to the west disappeared behind curtains of white, and the streets narrowed as snowdrifts built up along their edges. For Holden Freight and Supply, the harsh weather brought both challenges and opportunities. Deliveries became more difficult, requiring additional men and equipment, but demand increased as isolated communities depended more heavily on regular supply runs. Inside the warehouse office, a pot-bellied stove radiated welcome heat as Isabella reviewed the quarterly accounts, a sense of satisfaction warming her as much as the fire. Despite the winter conditions, despite Tanner's brief but frightening appearance 3 months earlier, the business had not merely survived, but thrived. Their contracts had expanded, their reputation for reliability growing throughout the territory. A knock at the door drew her attention from the ledgers. Sarah, their young office assistant, entered with a stack of mail. The afternoon post just arrived. Mrs. Blackwood, she said, placing the envelopes on the corner of the desk. And Mr. Donovan asked me to remind you about the staff gathering tonight. Isabella smiled. Thank you, Sarah. Tell him we haven't forgotten. It was Christmas Eve, and following a tradition established by Caleb's uncle, the employees of Holden Freight and Supply would gather in the warehouse for a modest celebration before dispersing to their various holiday destinations. Donovan had decorated a small pine tree with paper ornaments and candles, and the drivers had contributed a cask of cider that had been warming by the stove since morning. As Sarah departed, Isabella began sorting through the mail. Invoices, correspondence from suppliers, a letter from a potential new client in Durango. At the bottom of the stack, a plain envelope addressed simply to Mrs. Isabella Blackwood caught her attention. No return address, no postmark. It must have been delivered by hand. She opened it carefully, unfolding a single sheet of paper. The message was brief, written in an elegant, educated hand. I have information regarding the charges against Isabella Reyes in New Mexico Territory. Meet me at St. John's Cathedral, midnight, Christmas Eve. Come alone if you wish to clear your name. Isabella's hands trembled as she read the words a second time, then a third. Someone knew. Someone. had connected Mrs. Blackwood to the woman who had stood on that auction block. But who? And what information could they possibly have that would clear her name? She was still staring at the letter when Caleb entered, brushing snow from his coat. One look at her face told him something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked, crossing the room in quick strides. Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. His expression darkened as he read it. "It's a trap," he said immediately. "Someone trying to lure you out, vulnerable and alone." "Perhaps," Isabella agreed, "but what if it's legitimate? What if someone truly has evidence that could exonerate me?" Caleb set the letter down on the desk, his movements careful, controlled. "Think, Isabella, who would have such evidence? Who would deliver it in this manner, rather than approaching us directly during business hours?" She had no answer for that, only the desperate hope that had flared within her at the possibility of freedom. True freedom, not the tenuous security they had cobbled together through false identities and constant vigilance. "I have to go," she said finally. "I have to know. Then I'm coming with you," Caleb replied, his tone making it clear this was not a point he would concede. "The letter says to come alone." "I don't care what the letter says," he interrupted, uncharacteristic heat in his voice. "This is too dangerous to face alone." Their gazes locked in silent battle, each stubborn in their conviction. Finally, Isabella sighed. "We'll compromise. You can accompany me to the cathedral, but remain outside while I meet with whoever sent this." Caleb clearly didn't like the arrangement, but recognized it was the best he would get. "Fine, but at the first sign of trouble, I'm coming in." The staff gathering that evening passed in a blur for Isabella. She smiled and exchanged pleasantries, accepted a small gift from Sarah, hand-knitted gloves in soft blue wool, and distributed the year-end bonuses Caleb had insisted upon. But her thoughts remained fixed on the midnight meeting, on the mysterious letter and its tantalizing promise. St. John's Cathedral stood on the eastern edge of Denver, its Gothic spires reaching toward a sky heavy with snow cloud. As the carriage Caleb had hired approached, Isabella felt her heartbeat quicken. The stone building looked almost otherworldly in the darkness, illuminated only by the soft glow of lanterns flanking its massive wooden doors. "I still don't like this," Caleb said as the carriage rolled to a stop across the street. "At least take this." He pressed a small derringer into her hand, similar to the one he carried. "Just in case." Isabella tucked the weapon into her muff, praying she wouldn't need it in a house of worship on Christmas Eve. "Wait here," she instructed. "If I'm not back in 30 minutes, 20, Caleb counted. 20 minutes, she agreed. "Then you can come looking for me." She crossed the street alone, snow crunching beneath her boots, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. The cathedral doors were unlocked, as promised in the letter. Inside, the nave stretched before her, dimly lit by candles that cast long shadows among the wooden pews. The scent of incense hung in the air, mingling with the pine and bayberry of Christmas decoration. Isabella moved cautiously down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. "Hello?" she called softly. "Is anyone here?" Movement from a side chapel caught her attention. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, elegant in bearing, her face partially obscured by the hood of her cloak. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said, her voice cultured, confident. "Or should I say, Miss Reyes, thank you for coming." Isabella's hand tightened around the derringer in her muff. "You have me at a disadvantage. You know who I am, but I don't know you." The woman pushed back her hood, revealing a face that struck Isabella as vaguely familiar, though she couldn't immediately place it. "My name is Catherine Beck, Harlan Beck's wife." The shock of the revelation nearly caused Isabella to step backward. Harlan Beck's wife. The man who had tried to purchase her at the auction? Who had placed the bounty on her head? That man's wife now stood before her in a Denver cathedral. "What do you want?" Isabella asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Catherine Beck moved closer, her expression not hostile but resolute. "I want to end this vendetta my husband has against you, and I believe I have the means to do so." "Why would you help me?" Isabella's suspicion was evident in her tone. "Because contrary to what you might believe, Miss Reyes, not everyone in Redemption Creek is corrupt or cruel." Catherine's voice held a quiet dignity. "I know what my husband is. I know what he's done. To you, to others. I've lived with his brutality for 15 years. Isabella studied the woman more carefully now, noting the fine lines around her eyes, the careful way she held herself, proud, but as if protecting against unseen pain. "The horse," Catherine continued, "the one you were accused of stealing. It was found 2 days after your arrest, miles from where you were discovered. It had simply broken free of its paddock and wandered off. There was never any evidence linking you to its disappearance." Hope, dangerous and fragile, fluttered in Isabella's chest. "You can prove this." Catherine reached into her cloak, extracting a folded document. "This is a sworn statement from our stable master, attesting to finding the horse unharmed and showing no signs of having been ridden or mishandled. He brought this to my husband, who ordered him to keep silent about it." Isabella accepted the paper with trembling fingers, scanning its contents. The statement was notarized, legally binding. If genuine, it undermined the entire case against her. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come to me after all this time?" Catherine's gaze dropped briefly to her gloved hand. "My husband's obsession with finding you has only grown more intense. He speaks of little else. It has become," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "intolerable. I want it to end, and you believe this document will stop him? Not alone." "No." Catherine reached into her cloak again, producing a second paper. "This is a letter from Judge Wilson, acknowledging that the proceedings against you were improperly conducted, without evidence or due process. He's been troubled by his conscience since that day." Isabella could scarcely believe what she was hearing, what she was seeing. The documents in her hands represented everything she had dreamed of: legal proof of her innocence, vindication of what she had maintained all along. "There's more," Catherine said softly. "My husband's corruption extends far beyond your case. He's been taking land from settlers, intimidating homesteaders, using the law as a weapon against anyone who stands in his way. The territorial governor has opened an investigation based on evidence I've provided." Isabella stared at the woman before her, this unexpected ally from the most unlikely source. "You're testifying against your own husband." "I'm testifying for justice," Catherine corrected. Something Redemption Creek has seen too little of." She straightened her shoulders. "My husband will be arrested within the week. The charges against you will be formally dropped. You'll be free, Miss Reyes. Truly free." The weight of those words, the promise they contained, was almost too much to comprehend. Free, not living in fear, not hiding behind a false identity, not constantly looking over her shoulder. Free to live openly, honestly, as herself. "Why did you ask me to come alone?" Isabella asked, still cautious despite the evidence before her. "Why all this secrecy?" Catherine's expression tightened. "Because my husband has eyes everywhere. Because until he's in custody, you're still in danger. And because," she hesitated, "because I needed to see for myself what kind of woman had inspired such sacrifice from a man like Caleb Wyatt." At the mention of Caleb's name, his real name, Isabella felt her heart contract. "You know about him too." "I know he gave up everything to save you from my husband," Catherine said simply. "That kind of act reveals the true nature of both the giver and the recipient." She glanced toward the cathedral door. "He's waiting outside, isn't he?" Isabella nodded, unwilling to deny it. "Good," Catherine said. "You'll need each other in the days ahead. The truth sometimes causes as much upheaval as lies, at least initially." She reached out, touching Isabella's arm briefly. "Merry Christmas, Miss Reyes. Consider these documents my gift to you, and perhaps my atonement for standing silent too long." Before Isabella could respond, Catherine had replaced her hood and moved toward a side door, disappearing into the snowy night as quietly as she had appeared. Isabella stood alone in the cathedral, the documents clutched against her chest. Snow beginning to fall outside the stained glass windows like a benediction or a promise. Freedom. After so long, after so much struggle and fear, the possibility of freedom felt almost too fragile to trust. And yet, the evidence was tangible in her hands, the words clear and binding. She walked slowly back down the aisle, toward the main doors, toward Caleb waiting in the cold, toward whatever future might now be possible for them both. Spring came early to Denver that year, the snow retreating from the streets by late February, crocuses pushing through the softening earth in early March. The mountains remained white-capped in the distance, but in the city, life surged forward with the particular vigor that follows a harsh winter. As if making up for lost time, for dormant dreams. Isabella stood by the window of the warehouse office, watching as wagons were loaded for the day's deliveries. 3 months had passed since that Christmas Eve meeting in the cathedral. 3 months of cautious hope as Catherine Beck's promises gradually materialized. Word had reached Denver of Harlan Beck's arrest, of charges filed and evidence presented. The territorial governor had indeed launched an investigation into corruption in Redemption Creek, resulting in the dismissal of several officials and the appointment of a new sheriff. And just last week, the document Isabella had been waiting for had finally arrived, a formal letter from the territorial court dismissing all charges against her, acknowledging the lack of evidence and the improper proceedings. She was, officially and legally, a free woman. The bell above the office door jangled, pulling her from her thoughts. Caleb entered, his expression brightening as he saw her. "The final contracts are signed," he announced, setting his hat on the rack by the door. "The railroad has agreed to our terms for the Leadville distribution. We'll be their exclusive partner for all shipments to the smaller camps within 20 miles. Isabella smiled, genuine pleasure warming her despite the lingering uncertainty that had characterized these past months. "That's wonderful news. When do we begin?" "As soon as the line reaches Leadville. August dates they're projecting, though I'd wager September is more realistic." He moved to stand beside her at the window, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "We should celebrate." "Yes," she agreed. "Perhaps dinner at that new restaurant on Larimer Street? We could invite Donovan and the others." Caleb hesitated, something uncharacteristically uncertain in his manner. "Actually, I was thinking of something more private. Just the two of us." Isabella turned to face him fully, studying the subtle tension in his expression. "Is everything all right?" "More than all right," he assured her. "But there are things we need to discuss. Things that have been deferred while we waited for your situation to resolve." The careful phrasing didn't disguise his meaning. Since Christmas Eve, since the promise of Isabella's exoneration had transformed from desperate hope to tangible possibility, a strange hesitancy had developed between them. Neither had been willing to speak of the future, of what might come after her name was cleared, after the need for their arrangement had passed. "Yeah," she said softly. "I suppose there are." That evening, they closed the office early and walked together to a small but elegant restaurant tucked away on a side street near the theater district. The maitre d' greeted Caleb by name, suggesting he was a more frequent patron than Isabella had realized, and led them to a private table in a quiet corner, partially secluded by potted palm. After they had ordered, after the initial pleasantries about the business and the weather had been exhausted, a silence fell between them, not entirely uncomfortable, but weighted with unspoken question. "I received a letter from Edwards yesterday," Caleb finally said, referring to the merchant who had purchased his ranch. "He mentioned that Redemption Creek is growing. The railroad plans to extend a spur line there within the year." Isabella tensed slightly at the mention of the town that had nearly destroyed her. "I see. He also said my old property is prospering under his management." Caleb's tone was carefully neutral. "He's expanded the herd, built a new barn, the house too, apparently." "Are you homesick?" Isabella asked, the question emerging more vulnerable than she had intended. Caleb looked up from his glass, surprise evident in his expression. "For Redemption Creek, no. There was never much home there for me. But for the ranch," she persisted, "for the life you had before me." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Is that what you've been thinking? That I regret what I gave up?" Isabella smoothed her napkin across her lap, buying time to compose her thoughts. "It would be natural if you did. It was your father's legacy, everything you had worked for, and you sacrificed it all for a stranger." "Not for a stranger," Caleb corrected gently. "For what was right, for someone who deserved better than what that town was offering." He paused, then added more quietly, "Though I can't claim my motives were entirely selfless even then." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "Babe, what do you mean?" "I mean that even in that first moment, standing in that town square, watching you hold your head high despite everything." He shook his head slightly, as if still processing a memory that moved him. "There was something about you that I couldn't turn away from. something that mattered more than land or buildings or possessions. Heat rose in Isabella's cheeks, unexpected and intense. You couldn't have known me then. No, he agreed, but I recognized something in you that I understood. Dignity in the face of injustice, strength when there was every reason to break. His voice lowered. I didn't know you then, Isabella, but I know you now. The simple declaration hung between them, profound in its implications. For months they had lived side by side, building a business, crafting a shared life that existed within careful boundaries, all while a deeper current ran beneath the surface, unacknowledged but undeniably present. Your name has been cleared, Caleb continued after a moment. You're free to go wherever you choose, to build whatever life you want. Our arrangement was always meant to be temporary, a means of protection, until this day came. Isabella's heart contracted painfully. Was this his way of suggesting they part ways? Now that she no longer needed his protection, was he offering her release from their arrangement? And what do you want, Caleb? She asked, using his real name for perhaps the first time since they had arrived in Denver. And now that our arrangement is no longer necessary, he reached across the table, his hand covering hers in a gesture that felt both familiar and breathtakingly new. I want what I've wanted since that day on the stagecoach, when you looked out at the mountains with such wonder in your eyes. I want to build something real with you, Isabella, not out of necessity or protection or pretense, but out of choice. He hesitated, then finished simply, love. The word, so long unspoken between them, seemed to transform the air itself, making it difficult to breathe, to think clearly. Love, she repeated softly. If you don't feel the same, he said quickly, if you've been waiting for this day to start fresh somewhere else, I understand. The business is as much yours as mine now. We could make arrangements, ensure you have the resources to— Caleb, she interrupted, turning her hand beneath his so their palms met, fingers intertwining. I'm not going anywhere. The tension in his expression eased, hope replacing uncertainty. No, she confirmed. Whatever future I build, I want to build it with you. Not because you saved me, not because I owe you, but because somewhere between that auction block and this moment, I fell in love with you too. The admission, once made, felt like setting down a burden she had carried for far too long. The truth of it resonated through her entire being. She loved this quiet, steadfast man who had given everything for her, and then, somehow, given her even more: confidence, purpose, belonging. Caleb's smile transformed his entire face, the habitual reserve melting into something open and joyful. I had hoped, he said simply, but I didn't want to assume. No more assumptions, Isabella replied. No more unspoken truths between us. Later, as they walked back toward the warehouse through streets washed in the golden light of sunset, Caleb stopped suddenly, turning to face her. There's something else, he said. Something I've been waiting to ask until your name was cleared. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box, aged and slightly worn at the edges. This was my mother's, he explained as he opened it, revealing a simple gold band set with a single small emerald. My father gave it to her when they decided to build a life together, despite all the reasons the world gave them not to. Isabella's breath caught as understanding dawned. Caleb, Isabella Reyes, he said, her true name sounding like a benediction on his lips. Will you marry me? Not as part of an arrangement or a necessity, but as a choice we make together. The emerald caught the fading sunlight, gleaming like a promise. Isabella looked from the ring to Caleb's face, this man who had changed everything, who had offered his hand when she needed it most, and never once made her feel indebted for it. Yes, she said, the word emerging clear and certain. Yes, I will marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, where it settled as if it had always belonged there. Then, in the middle of the Denver street with carriages passing and pedestrians hurrying by, he drew her into his arms and kissed her, their first real kiss since that night in Redemption Creek when truth had first breached the walls between them. 2 weeks later, they stood together in St. John's Cathedral, the same cathedral where Isabella had received the documents that freed her. But this time, the cathedral was filled with light rather than shadows, with friends rather than secrets. Donovan stood as Caleb's best man, beaming with pride, and only minimal awkwardness in his Sunday suit. Sarah and the other employees of Holden Freight and Supply filled the first pews, alongside merchants and business associates who had come to respect the Blackwoods as vital members of Denver's commercial community. As Isabella walked down the aisle, wearing a gown of ivory silk with emerald ribbons that matched her ring, she caught sight of a figure at the back of the cathedral, a woman in an elegant blue dress who nodded once in solemn acknowledgement before slipping quietly out the side door. Catherine Beck, come to witness the culmination of her Christmas gift. Before the altar, Caleb waited, his grey eyes never leaving hers as she approached. When she reached him, he took her hands in his, and together they turned to face the minister. "Dearly beloved," the elderly man began, his voice carrying through the sun-dappled space, "we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." As the familiar words washed over her, Isabella felt a profound sense of rightness, of completion. The journey that had begun on an auction block in a dusty frontier town had led here to this cathedral, to this man, to this moment of choosing and being chosen. When they exchanged their vows, Isabella spoke her true name for all to hear. Isabella Maria Reyes, no longer hiding, no longer running. And when Caleb replied with his own name, Caleb Thomas Wyatt, it felt like the final piece of truth sliding into place between them. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As they turned to face their assembled friends, now truly husband and wife-in-law as well as heart, Isabella caught a glimpse of the mountains through the cathedral windows, majestic, enduring, free, like the love that had carried them from that desperate day to this triumphant one, a love worth everything they had sacrificed and everything they had gained.